Okay, so if everyone's kind of going through the same emotional roller coaster of COVID that I have, I'm going to assume that we're all likely sitting at home in our makeshift offices. We've moved past shock and denial and maybe past anger, although I think that there might be some residual anger. We probably already overstocked on pasta and peanut butter in panic mode and maybe have eaten most of it. We, or at least I, fell for the banana bread thing, and I even downloaded TikTok to see what the fuss was about. And maybe some of us have had or witnessed a few Zoom whoopsies, and we're settling into some sort of semblance of acceptance that this could be the normal for a while. And if that's the case, we want to really think about what it is that we should be judging this normal by. And we want to start with talking about, how bad is it? And a couple of measures looking at previous crises of the past and analyzing by 5 of what we're calling crisis dimensions. So the first of which is the S&P, and I think this is something that we're seeing all across the news. It is the first place we go to look for volatility and kind of a sense of what everybody else thinks. I think if we look at a graph over time, and this is one that looks at in S&P 500 since 1927, looking at inflation-adjusted numbers. What we see is that while a lot, of course, economic factors have changed since then, and we can look at the value created in the market being far greater than what it was in the 1920s. However, even looking at that, we see that there are similar trends to look at. There are not today, we don't see as low of a low as we did in the past. However, similar patterns have emerged that you start to see drops, rebounds, and recoveries, and then drops again. So just zooming into a more narrow view over the last couple months, we start to see that there have been drops that we were expecting, and then rebounds that perhaps we were not expecting as much. As recently as this weekend, we heard Warren Buffett talk about this not being the worst of it yet, that further drops are likely. I tend to agree, and I think that we've seen from business leaders sort of hedging their bets and thinking on more cautious lines. But that's not to say that everything is all doom. And what we look at also is really the impact of COVID-19 on household income. And we're looking at it cut a couple of different ways. So just in the US alone, there's about 50% or so who say that their household income has remained about the same. Other countries, especially in Europe, I would say France being the exception, are posting lower rates than that, and Germany higher than that. So there is something to be said of us, US in particular, being somewhere in the middle of the line in terms of being able to find individual households buoyed by stimulus directly in the hands of people, small businesses. But the fact remains that many people across the board in the US as well are reporting a slight or significant reduction in their household income. This compared to 2008, where we saw many more people talking about a reduction in their household income. And I think what is interesting for me here, and I see it happening in China already, which are, many say are weeks ahead of us in terms of the fallout, that 9% say that they've increased slightly or increased a lot in terms of household income. And I find that very interesting. I wonder what personal, finances might be looking like that have allowed them to increase so many people to increase their household income as compared to pre-COVID. And I also wonder what of that applies to the US. Unemployment, I think, is another measure altogether, but hugely important. And perhaps what we see on the previous slide in terms of those folks that report about the same household income is in fact due to the massive amounts of unemployment claims filed. The US Bureau of Labor and Statistics released even today about 33.5 million total in terms of unemployment or jobless claims, which is putting us at something like 22% unemployment in just the COVID time. Far higher than what was expected a month ago, and getting us pretty close to what we were around the 1930s. So perhaps household income is leveling off to a degree. We see that unemployment is not. Consumer confidence, I think, is a little bit of a mark of optimism. And the fact remains that many people are either optimistic or unsure and all things considered, I will take unsure as a degree of positivity in terms of their own country's economic recovery. China is far more optimistic than other countries, but US is not doing so badly either, which I think has a reflection on the way that state and local as well as national government and sort of politics aside may have sort of impacted the perception of what recovery might look like. This is, of course, May 2020, so a few days ago is when this was taken. I believe this will be an important measure to watch and will definitely impact the way we imagine consumers will spend in the future. This one I threw in because I love it, because it measures what we think as consumers is essential. And so while in the, I would say March and April, early days, you start to see things that are expected. And this is just a graph of US toys and game sales. And within this specific view, some things are expected. You expect parents and families to be buying things to entertain their kids. But how many of us would have expected that trampolines also saw a massive boost? This to me says something about the state of mind of people, of what they're willing to spend on. Trampolines cost anywhere, in the low thousands, as opposed to a jigsaw puzzle, which is of course far less than that. So what does it say about what we deem as worth the money? Is it that these are things that entertain us and our children, or actually at this point we would spend anything to wear our kids out and have them go to bed early? But I find that these will be some of the audience insights, customer insights that will help us define what does it really mean, what will people really spend on, even when wallets are shrinking. The truth remains that we don't have a yardstick yet. We don't know the size and the depth of the total damage, and therefore we don't know what recovery will look like. But four things I believe will contribute to what we think, what shape recovery will take. First is the recurrences before vaccine. There's lots of talks about this, about how long it will take, who's in the mix, who will get there first. But the point is that we don't know when that will happen, and there will likely be several recurrences before vaccine, which means we will live under the shadow of a resurgence, no matter when a vaccine comes. Secondly, there are secondary commercial ripple effects. So businesses that may not have today reported enormous changes in volume or demand, but that over time will be indirect beneficiaries or indirectly be impacted by the sort of disruption. So what does the damage look like for them for a year from now? So maybe not so much tourism, but about the associated industries linked to tourism, like travel insurance. Also true that digital commerce has accelerated by 10 and 12x, depending on what measures you look at. So what does that mean for physically reliant brick and mortar businesses when shelter in place subsides? Do we all of a sudden remember why we like brick and mortar, or have we become used to digital commerce and therefore we will start to see ongoing halo effects on retail and foot traffic? The runway to consumer spending, we talked about this a little bit, but I think this has a lot to do with whether consumer wallets will allow spending and when, and secondly, how long it'll take for consumers not just to want to go out, but also be able to physically go out and spend their dollars where they used to. And this last one I think is really important to me. I think this one is one that often goes overlooked when we talk about it from an economic perspective, but renewed global isolationism is something that we, governments and leaders were working on, and highly contentious issue even in the months and years leading up to this crisis. But as a virus that travels fearlessly across boundaries, what does it mean for governments trying to protect their citizens? Will there be more rigid isolationism? Will populist leaders start to campaign on these things? Will we find that there's even more fear about people who, and our neighbors? That is another sort of enormous influence in how we'll look at recovery. But I think there are a couple of things that are all of us have resolved to do right now, which is sort of just get through the crisis. So for governments who are looking at protecting lives at the expense of the economy and commerce. We understand it's a hope to get through what they can right now without curbing as much loss and damage as they can before they can get to the point of re-energizing the economy. From a consumer perspective, it's really about protecting savings and cutting spending, which we know to be the case in every major recession or downturn. But from a company's perspective, I think there have been lots of important and tough choices to make. Lots of executives who look at survival in the near term, a preservation approach, keeping close your core business units, your high performing teams that act as profit centers, your assets that are category advantages today, really at the expense of future focused growth, recent acquisitions, any competitive plays you had made, things that were nice to have and all important in flush times. So for marketers, for those of you who are thinking about how to inform your company's business decisions, your strategy moving forward, it is just as important for you to really be thinking about informing leadership decisions about what constitutes the core and what constitutes your periphery. So if you think about your work streams and your MarTech ecosystem, your data stack, what is essential? What partners carry more than their fair share of their weight? And we think this is a really important exercise. So a couple of principles here. So if all of us are thinking about creating cash cushions from non-essential business units, we should also be thinking about protecting ones that punch above their weight. What are the ones, the business units, the disciplines within your organization that have consistently punched above their weight, that have given more bang for buck? Keeping costs predictable and linear, this is sort of a generic principle we think is appropriate across the board. But for marketers, what are the partners and tools that allow you to predict your costs over time? That if you add a unit or subtract a unit, you understand exactly what you're going to get in terms of value. Really re-examining any unnecessary variability. So things that are percentages of media spend, things that are percentages of value, those are definitely things to take a look at and re-examine value. Reinvesting brainpower behind restoring demand, thinking of new usage occasions. I think this is a huge one. I recently heard an example of jewelry companies, major US retailers that are traditionally selling in brick and mortar and have been in the past, but are actually now finding a resurgence of sales by selling through TV channels, which in 2020, perhaps we didn't really ever imagine that we'd be admitting that or finding that, but why not? If we're talking about opportunity and outlet, I think restoring demand, new and old usage occasions are all fair game. Focusing on and strengthening your competitive advantage, this is the time for that. Remind yourselves and your customers what that is. What is it that you truly offer your audiences, your customers, that your competitors do not? Let's put a bullseye on it and fine tune it, because it will be choices like that today, making sure we're fine tuning that are really the way forward. So New York Times released a very simple 30-second spot on truth, and they always seem to pick the most contentious times to come back with the power of truth. And there is a spot on the sort of myths or conspiracies that have been circulating, and in the end they talk about why being informed and the truth helps. In the end, they really remind all of us that their competitive advantage always has been in all times, just being champions of fact. And I think lastly, and a lot of times this one gets characterized as fluff, as a nice to have, but I think it's among the top for me. Focusing on the employees and communities your business supports. It's not just goodwill, and it's not just about making sure your work family gets through this. It's also about ensuring your own success in the future. So Unilever, which we all know the size and scale of Unilever, has launched a $550 million cash facility plan for its suppliers. I think that kind of a move is a bold one. It's recognizing that without its own suppliers, Unilever itself does not have a future. So how do our major organizations really take care of suppliers and vendors, recognizing that their own growth and their own future lies in the future of their partners? So these are the things that we think about just in the near term to survive the crisis. But what I'm really excited about is the future. The first order of the day in any of these downturns is, of course, to survive it. But the second one is to benefit from these new patterns. So the global pandemic and the scale and the devastation in many ways is new to us. And we use words like unprecedented and novel. But while this particular pandemic is novel, disruption at very large scale is not new. And if we look back and we take a wide angle lens to what's happening right now, what we'll find is that there are parallels in the past. Times when there were changes in the rules, new players emerged, and new winners arose. So if we look back in history, which is my favorite thing to do, there's a phrase from econometrics that really applies here called structural breaks. So it's a break in time series data when your trend or your trends and your patterns among variables change. Basically what that means is that the rules change. And for any businesses making investments, the investments you thought would make your business go up and to the right, if we just think about success that way, those moves may not behave that way anymore. And when a business model or an economy shifts this way, it's called a structural break. And I appreciate you allowing me that nerd out. But I really do believe it's applicable here. And in the case of global socioeconomic disruption, when we see something like that, it signals a systemic force majeure or a change in the environment. And it makes sort of existing patterns obsolete. So I'll go through a couple, but not all of these. Just looking at the 1890s, right around the time of the long recession. And right before industrialization, we had years of a railroad boom. So mass manufacturers moving westward and eastward from both coasts, basically laying railroad tracks and allowing people to travel far and wide. Massive recession hits, people are not traveling as much. But then you have players like GE who capitalize on the fact that people are staying and looking for work near the home and find that this is the time to really generate power in small and large towns to make manufacturing plants, warehouses, factories become sources of economic growth. And they become poised for some of the biggest industrialization successes that come in the 1900s. Kellogg's positioned themselves as a mass production winner with their shelf-sustainable goods right up until World War II hit, where they really found themselves to be during a time of, as we know, in the 1930s to be Great Depression, one of the very few winners of the time. Customers actually talk about how they stocked up on Kellogg's goods and were surprised at how long it lasted. So Kellogg's really figured out a way to make the most of a downturn. And I'll skip ahead to Netflix, which is another good example for me. So 2008, 2009, we know there is one of the bigger financial crises in recent history. We talk about how changes and shrinking wallets led people to spend more time at home. Unemployment rates, although less than what we see today, still very significant. People are choosing to find sort of homegrown ways of entertaining themselves. Netflix pivots from a DVD-based model to an internet entertainment model, and really rides a digital, or what we're calling a diet digital consumption era. When you start to see things coming in smaller modules, subscription services, streaming services, you saw diet digital consumption become a thing, and Netflix really owning that, coming out as one of the bigger players. So all of these things, I think, tell us, how to think about right now. So while we don't know what the next era will look like, we know we're coming out of algorithmic transformation, we're coming out of personalization and custom services, and we're here in the pandemic downturn. And one thing is for sure, which is that the wrong way forward in structural breaks like these is to try more of the same. So what does our particular structural break look like? Who becomes obsolete? What are the new rules now? And what can marketing do to really create breakaway success? So there's a couple things that I think we should think about, and it has to do with hard choices. What are your business advantages? And in order for you to answer that at an executive level and as marketers who have a seat at that table, the question is twofold. How is your audience accessing you right now? So what is your business model? And for how long will that avenue be disrupted? So what is the depth and length of industry demand disruption? That's the x-axis, and the business model is on the y. The answers to those questions will help you figure out what your strategic approach should be. Should you shift your business model like Netflix, thinking about what your true value is, but just reorienting how you distribute your value? So going from physical to streaming. Are you bound to sustaining your business and restoring operations because you've not been impacted that much? So those are things like essential subscription services, telecom, electricity. Will you find that actually your volume and your business model don't need to change that much? And if that's the case, you sort of stay in that place. If you are like a physical experience, like theme parks, salons, or event venues, you might really need to think much more dramatically to shape entirely new businesses. And that being the case, you know, we believe that there are a bigger and more transformative change coming down your path. One amazing example on a small scale that I want to share with you is our salons. Salons, I read an article in the New York Times about a salon franchise that's looking to look at their core assets. So that's really their space, their hair specialists, their talent, you know, the emotional benefits that come with doing your hair and preparing for an occasion or a special event. Those being their core assets, they're thinking about how to repurpose, and they've come up with a solution to have small mobile salons that travel to you or to high foot traffic areas in workplaces or fashion kind of neighborhoods that are basically turning the idea on its head, that the same value can be brought to you no matter where you are. Will it work? Could not tell you, but I think these are the kinds of tough choices and dramatic resolutions that we do need to charge ourselves with. And then I think it's how can marketing support that? You know, if we're talking about a future of touchless commerce, what is it that marketing can do to restore or capture new demand, to curb disruption with new distribution ideas? And how can you find new competitive advantages if actually your old ones are falling away? So now I would like for us to shift gears a little bit. We're talking a lot about sort of the strategic imperatives of your business. And I've always believed that marketers belong in that conversation. And it is imperative for our executives and for our chief marketing teams to really be in lockstep when we think about how to move forward, where demand comes from, and what advantages are. However, I think there are some things that are very specific to a marketer's toolbox and marketing strategy that we need to kind of double click on and spend more time on. So what I want to share now are a couple of marketing specific approaches that we think are key sort of action points to walk away with. So if we're talking about making hard choices and choosing strategic action that looks something like one of these four sort of approaches, depending on what you've chosen, and recognizing that likely for most of us, marketing budgets are in flux. Either they've been cut dramatically, or there are big question marks as to what they will look like for the next quarter. So what we're going to talk about today is a little bit focal points for those of us with tight budgets, areas to throw your weight behind, because there's real power there and greater value for money. The first is resilience. So minimizing impact to customers by paying close attention to changes in the customer journey. And the point really here is to pay attention to what the new customer journey looks like. How do people reach you and your product? What steps do they take? Where are the new barriers? And by listening, and the closer that we listen, the less we carry over the impact or the shock to our end consumer. And I think the action point here is leaning on journey analytics and enlisting market research. For any of us who've done the big, customer journey sort of ethnographies and focus groups, segmentation, customer profiling, this is a time to really think about paying attention to your analytics team, to all your touch points in your customer journey, and being led by those data points. The next one is agility. So assuming that we all have evolving audience compositions, it's imperative that we challenge user profiles and ascribed motivation. So Having done those segmentations, having really thought about what motivates our audiences, we have probably all done the work of figuring out audience X or segment X is driven by motivators 1, 2, and 3, and would need to see messaging 1, 2, and 3 in order to move down the funnel. I encourage us and challenge us to put that away, to really think about this anew. As we think about who's actually buying from us, why they're buying from us, and if they're buying for more than themselves or for other people's because their household composition has changed, we really need to reevaluate. And I think that action to take is about bringing in and protecting partners that allow continuous dynamic testing. I would be wary of static planning and locked commitments, and I would sort of throw my weight behind partners that allow continuous and dynamic testing, and operating those kinds of processes in-house that allow that iterative test and learn approach, so that we can continuously be learning who our audiences are and are not anymore. And lastly, predictability. So anticipating customers in new spaces, bound to new behaviors. The flip side of new audiences also is that they actually show up in different places now. So where we had on-the-go, mobile-first audiences that were streaming in subways and things like that, we actually, as all of us know and are living, a different kind of media consumption experience, meaning that the TV sometimes is on all day, and all day parts are seeing an uptick, that many people are using one device, which was always the case perhaps, but that we're finding even more so. And the ratio of number of people per device has increased in COVID. So what does that mean about who your audience is reaching at any given time? I think that really means we should all be keeping space for predictive technology to capture new pockets of demand and attention, and in an effort to really minimize waste. The point being that we will not be able to predict on our own who those new audiences are, where they are right now, because we don't have enough historical data about COVID and about how people behave in lockdown in terms of media consumption. We're just starting to learn that. So if we wait for all that data to come through and then start our media planning, we will have lost what I think to be huge potential. But if we're leaning more heavily on predictive technology, on technology that can anticipate demand and show up, meaning show your ads in places where it can generate and predict demand, that's, I think, your surest way to minimize waste. What I'd like to quickly do is go through a couple of the points we just mentioned in a closer view. And this is in an effort for the folks on the phone and for marketing teams who are listening, there's 3 areas, as we talked about, that I think deserve greater attention and actually could serve as separate webinars on their own. What I've tried to do is tune our focus to the 6 things that are important to focus on when it comes to the customer journey. So if we're thinking about our unique selling propositions, how do we show up today all across our various touch points, from TV and online video to lower funnel search keywords to any kinds of collaborations with brands? What does our unique selling proposition look like if you have to transpose them on a different customer journey? I challenge us all to think about that way. Secondly, what we know to be true is that our relationships between media metrics are likely going to change. What might have, let's say, 100 million impressions, we knew to be true to or directly correlated to a 0.5% lift in sales, making these numbers up, I would suggest that those correlations are likely suspect. And we don't know how many impressions it will take to lift sales anymore, because everyone's normal course of behavior has really disrupted that. And structural breaks actually really do impact things like media metrics and sales correlation. So what I would suggest is that we continue to re-examine our media mix models and what is truly driving sales. And secondly, where we can, be looking at beyond proxy measurement. So how are we able to optimize our media directly to offline sales? Where are the places and the partners that we're able to do that? Lastly, and excitingly for me, conducting market research is a personal favorite of mine, having been at creative agencies and market research companies. But I know that those are things that are can be expensive and are go-tos for flush times. But efficient market research today is still worthwhile. There are lots of partners that are litmus tests of what our audiences are thinking right now, and take far less time and far less budgets. A couple off the top of my head, MindSumo and CrowdTap are ones that I've seen. And for anyone interested in learning more about efficient market research, I'm happy to help if at the end there are questions about it. Letting customer journey analytics lead decision-making, especially as relationships to brands change, and culling data from every touch point. I think it's now more important than ever to maintain a single unified view of customers. We have always challenged ourselves to do that, and we talk about it as marketers incessantly. I would say, foot to the pedal, and now is the time. How are we able to pull our many siloed views of our audiences into single views now? And this is part of that accelerating of digital transformation I spoke about earlier. If we can master it now, I think we will be setting ourselves up for far greater success coming out of this. And lastly, empowering our own storytellers, those folks on your teams who know how to translate data to insights and insights to experiences. They are increasingly valuable right now. I think that we will start to find that there are new stories emerging from the data, and they will not look like old patterns. They will not resemble customers we knew before. And all we can really do to prepare ourselves is to have the right people on board. Granted, times are tight for everyone, and there are lots of conversations about leaner teams and how to manage moving forward. If those decisions are still being made, if those are calculations that executives are still making, I would definitely voice the power and the value, the return on investment, so to speak, of storytellers. I think this is exactly the time. And talking a little bit about agility, if we are challenging profiles about who our audience is today, we should think about messaging relevance. For brands that are talking about slimming benefits, maybe now is the time to talk about protein or nutrient-rich benefits. If you're assuming that you are talking to one person, but now actually that person is buying for 3 or 5, or was buying for 3 as head of household and is now buying for 1, all of that is in flux. And it is important to have broader messaging and more dynamic messaging to allow for different buying situations. The third piece is emotional charge. So flavors and things that are used to be just sort of secondary or tertiary benefits, I think the variety is becoming a greater benefit now, and a source of stimulus. As our routines become more and more straightforward and predictable, we're relying more on variety and flavor profile to give us a daily sense of distinction, to make yesterday different than today. I think the point is that we no longer know what our audiences exactly want to hear, so we do have to go away from the prescribed messaging tree, which is the diagram you see on the left. Audience X wants to see message Y. And what we need to move towards is a concept of creative incrementality, which is that many of our assumptions we need to throw away about what our audiences need to hear. And the fact is, we don't have all the data today of what it is that our audiences want to hear in this new shelter in place or lockdown environment. So what is important to do is to really think about creating an environment that tests and learns creative against audiences, so that you're dynamically figuring out and letting platforms, whether it's your existing digital platforms, whether it has to do with your creative teams in-house or agency partners, creating protocols and processes that let creative be iterated quickly and creative resonance be driven by audiences. And lastly, the predictability part of this, which I think is a conundrum for many of us. So, we all talk about unprecedented times, we talk about volatility. The thing we're all looking for is some degree of control and predictability. And as marketers, I think we crave it even more so. We cannot predict customer behavior right now. We don't know what new purchase patterns will look like, and we can't predict consumption. But we have some early signs of what we can see as upticks during this time. And I think the outcome leads to, or the takeaway is really that we need to look at the kinds of partners and processes that have allow us to anticipate demand in a more mechanical form. So if we're just talking about, purchases, we've seen an uptick in food delivery users and alcohol sales, as well as bread machine sales and do-it-yourself hair coloring. The latter two, or the last one, I could kind of understand that as salons become unavailable, people are finding home solutions for hair care. Bread machine is really hard to imagine or explain. Lots of micro trends sitting in there, sourdough starters and banana bread and things like that, and focaccia. But it's starting to become an area of interest. What are these sort of fad-driven uptakes, and which of them are going to last in the future? In terms of family activities, we're seeing park foot traffic increase more than 2019 at the same time. So even when we weren't in COVID, we weren't in lockdown, we are actually now spending more time in foot traffic, and that's Google mobility foot traffic data. 10% increase in yard activities, same time last year, and same with YouTube Kids streaming. So there's something going on about kids and parenting and the demand it's taking because of the time we're spending at home. So while we perhaps cannot pinpoint the exact places and devices as a theme, I think we're starting to see a pattern here. And then for folks at home who are working, consuming content on their desktop has seen an increase, watching esports and playing games. All of that measured in adults 24 to 37, Global Web Index, same time last year. So just spending more time at home, even though you might still be at a desktop at work, had you been last year, we're seeing increase in how you're spending your entertainment time on desktop instead of mobile. Broadcast TV, all day part seeing an uptick, as well as streaming TV. I think that is interesting news for TV, even though there is a big hole in ad spend in terms of TV revenue right now. People are watching, and what does that say about changing our day parts or our media mix in general? Folks using their phone to consume news now more than ever. What does that say about the places we would place our display ads and listening to music? Overall, I think let's focus our digital media where it's flexible, and let's look for broad themes instead of specific platform directives. What that really tells me is about brand building. So if we talk about just the massive $10 billion hole in the television ad market right now, the cost of digital ads has also dropped by at least a third or more in some cases. This is a report from Facebook, and I apologize that I don't have more recent data, but it goes up until April 9th. And it does tell us that CPMs, and more importantly, engagement metrics like cost per view and cost per engagement have also dropped. This is exciting to me at a time when customer or competitors of yours might be pulling back spend, wondering what it is they want to talk about. We're starting to see that actually engaged audiences, Facebook's most engaged audiences, are even cheaper now than they have been in the past to go after. Now is the time, I believe, to earn loyalty, deploying your own creative and brand teams to think on a more magnanimous COVID response, and use the ad space in a way that you probably couldn't, or to the degree you couldn't have before. It's also true that brand loyalty is very likely to be tested in times of downturn. So 1 in 2 millennials in 2020 are willing to try alternate options when they can't find their favorites, which is up from 1 in 3 in 2019. So there is market share to be had, there is ad space to be had, and I think there's loyalty and brand love to be had as well. And now into some of my favorite parts of this, which is what are brands doing today? Snapshots from the field. What we've seen are a slew of brands saying all the right things. And I won't call out any brands in particular, but I think what has happened, first wave, we saw a bunch of brands doing the logo distancing, which mixed reviews, some backlash, but it was early times and we didn't really know what we were getting into. Second wave is this more lukewarm, sort of safe sentiment about, a similar sort of vibe, talking about being distant but still apart, using words like unprecedented or uncertain times. What I loved was a YouTube creator, Microsoft Sam, put together a montage called COVID Commercials Exactly the Same, and used about 50 brands or so, cut exactly in a way that you can take the intro music, the somber piano track, take the drone view of the empty venue or the empty highway, take the language apart put together, and then the kind of anthemic rising close of "We will rise" or "We are still here." I couldn't be certain about whether these are good or bad. I think what is important is that they are the same, and the question remains: what was it money well spent? If we wanted to be out there, we wanted to earn and stay top of mind, but we ended up looking like a lot of the others. On the flip side, what would have happened had we done nothing, and would have saying nothing been better or worse? And the reason I present this to us all is really that, we don't know the correct way forward, but the truth remains that there is loyalty to be had and market share to be stolen. And I think there are examples of brands who've taken meaningful strategic action more than messaging. And that's what I really, what I want to kind of point to as lessons to be learned. So the first is, I'm going to go through a couple of brands that I think have done very, very specific things, actions to be taken. And it's fallen into one of two categories. So either they've doubled down on advantages, so they've elevated their continued role, even though it's a new world order, or they've chosen a calculated risk in a new direction. So really thinking about behavior waves and organic category demand in their favor, and saying, okay, this is a calculated risk I can make and will likely be okay. And the first is Chipotle. A year or so ago, they made a pretty big investment in digital transformation with their app, and they hired a consulting agency and a web development agency and a company, and put in many millions of dollars in revamping their interface, so that customers could not just buy in store, but have a really easy app experience. That was an investment made last year, and what they were able to see this year is that so far, as of end of April, their in-store transactions declined by roughly 70%, as to be expected, but their deliveries increased by 150%, and advance orders jumped 220. Their average basket size, and this is what I think is very interesting, for digital orders has been higher during COVID. So people are ordering for more than themselves, and actually each digital order has been higher than each individual order pre-COVID. There's something to be said about doubling down on your advantage, which is a existing ingoing digital platform. Oreo is one of my favorites, always coming in with something creative or playful, which is their brand positioning. During this time, during COVID, they have released a series of commercials on staying home and staying playful, which is of course service to the larger greater good, but also concurrently they've been able to release a whole slew of new flavors, some that they're kind of bringing back from the 80s and 90s, others that are completely new, and the idea being that they really do understand the role they play in people's homes and people's daily routines, which is flavor and variety at a time when we're seeing so much of the same in our routines every day. And I think that was a really smart move. They've seen an uptick in sales, and they've also seen a whole lot of brand engagement and loyalty in the last few weeks. IBM doubles down on a legacy advantage. They have always talked about putting smart to work. This is a call to action that we heard after the New Deal, after 2008 financial crisis, which is build, build, build. Let's put our biggest tech geniuses, our innovators, our engineers to work, and let's create a new era of human development. And they released an ad that talked about IBM, having always been a legacy partner to growth. So they end with a lovely line after a slew of small business tech sort of small businesses being featured in their ads. They end with the line, "It's not all we can do, but it's a start. Let's put smart to work." And I think that really, kind of reckons back to a different time and a much greater vision coming out of this. Old Spice doubles down on audience commitment. They have always been a proponent of African-American segments, often talking about, sort of African-American health issues in their ad space. They have committed and redeployed all of their spots on TV and online video to talking about how the COVID-19 has really disproportionately affected African-Americans, more so than other populations, and why that is. So taking a brand, revamping their space, face, not talking about the product at all, but instead shedding light and using their platform to shed light on a community that they really care about. I think that's a true, bold, strategic action that I believe will repay them many times over. Paris Baguette is another one that I'm not sure how I feel about this, but I think it's worth talking about. They've made a sort of a pretty big bet, I think. They are scooping up a ton of retail real estate right now. You might have seen these in your own neighborhoods, but Paris Baguettes are opening like wildfire across the country. And they are talking about this time when many other brick and mortar stores are closing, retail locations are going up for sale or up for rent. Paris Baguette is scooping them up at better deals. And their CEO talks about this as an investment in the future and a way to grow their total assets at a time when it's cheapest, and really kind of securing their base in the neighborhoods that matter most to them. Zappos, this I will say my favorite example on the slide. Zappos has always been known for great customer service. What they're doing is customer service for anything. You can call them now, and it doesn't have to be about any of their products or Zappos at all. If you call them and you ask them a question about where to get kettlebells, where to get COVID testing, antibody testing, where to get anything you can think of, they've opened up their customer service so that you can ask them anything. But the utility is the same. They are the brand that is valuing customer service above all. The fact that it opens the doors to any sort of utility is sort of besides the point. They come out of this sort of being customer first and customer service first. And then lastly, Quibi, which I think is, for those of you that have heard, a new sort of tele-streaming platform that serves bite-sized interactive sort of content on your phone, was set to launch in April, about a year ago was the plan, and had to turn things around within a couple of weeks because of COVID. So all of their positioning was about quick bites on the go, quick TV bites on the go. But if you're not really on the go on anymore, and people are have time to watch longer form, how would a platform like this succeed? And what we actually see is that they found a way to innovate around that, and close to 3 million or so downloads in the first 2 weeks. And I think that's really saying something. Before I get to the last slide, one quick call out, or actually two quick call outs. One, I think there are a couple of brands that have done something, extraordinary. I think Burger King is one of them with their Couch Potatriot, talking about staying at home for the country. And I find that to be a great message in line with their brand positioning, which is, can sometimes be seen as, sort of championing or encouraging fast food eating and gaming and couch potato, things like that. And they're sort of owning that. That's another double down of your brand positioning in service of your country, which I think is a greater message. And the second is Jared, a fine jewelry retailer that sort of with the idea of being a diamond ring kind of provider and really being a sponsor of weddings. How could they take a role in virtual weddings, and started a campaign called Love Can't Wait, being all about Jared as a promoter of virtual weddings. What I love about that is it takes them away from the wedding event and a beacon or a symbol for weddings, and moves them into love and marriage, which is a far more enduring and emotional place. And I'm really interested to see how that turns out for them in the next couple of years. I think that's a calculated risk, but a smart one, adjacent to their existing brand positioning. All right, we're getting close to the end, and I'm going to do quick takeaways, then I'm going to stop for questions. A couple of summary sort of points for us to walk away with. As we think about our people, so that's our employees and our customers, let's continue to challenge customer profiles. Let's let the journey lead decision-making, and let's empower our data storytellers. In our processes, incentivize tinkering and testing, always sort of ongoing testing, because we don't know the answers yet, and all we can predict is really that we have yet things to learn. Invest in creative incrementality, firm up your marketing pandemic plan, because we know this won't be the last one. And shame on us once, perhaps, and I can forgive a lot of us who I think many of us can, who understand how unpredictable and sort of how out of the blue this felt. But if it happens again and we don't have a plan, I think that puts us in a dangerous spot. Partners, maintaining predictable costs, measuring the true drivers of sales beyond media proxies, which we know will change, anticipating and capturing new pockets of demand. And lastly, in terms of our product, let's reimagine new use cases for our homebound lives. You think about salons, you think about Oreo, and delivering greater utility than advertised. Think about Kellogg's lasting longer on your shelf than you imagined. The point, I think, really is this pandemic, or what Bill Gates calls pandemic #1, could give rise to a new era of human development and shepherd in new winners. But who amongst us will aim for more than just recovery?